Tonight, folks, we are going to be talking about, are competitive rules better for everybody? And you might be saying, what does he mean by competitive rules? What does he mean better for everybody? So, what do I mean by competitive rules? Some games are designed to be competitive or have tournament play in mind. So when the designers, when the games companies, whoever it is, are designing that game, they have that tournament market in mind. Games like X-Wing, games like War Machine and Hordes, Guild Ball was one of these games, and Warhammer Underworlds. I mean, Warhammer Underworlds was specifically kind of designed to target almost that X-Wing market that was kind of like getting a bit of a creep on the 40k crowd. Some games are just designed to be completely kind of casual or narrative, however you want to position it. So some games like Rangers of Shadowdeep, you wouldn't kind of say that was a competitive game. Games like Frostgrave, The Walking Dead All Out War, and things like Burrows and Badgers. These are designed to be quite gentle is a word I was going to use, but I wouldn't say that they're kind of like a gentle game. They're designed to be just players kind of have a bit of fun. You can kind of, I suppose, sort of, you could have an event as opposed to a tournament, but they're not designed to be finely balanced or be mega competitive, if you like. And then some games aren't designed with tournament play in mind, or competitive play, but they end up being adapted by a community that really likes that game and likes to play competitive games. So All Out War, for example, was kind of developed by the community, I think, to be able to be played competitively. And then Mantic went on and released The Walking Dead, not All Out War, Call to Arms, I forgot the name there, which was a more competitive focused side of those rules. And then we get games like Warhammer 40k, I would say previous editions rather than 9th edition, and Age of Sigmar as well. Because these kind of means that being designed with competitive play in mind, it generally means that the rules are a lot tighter. It means that there's very little ambiguity. Balanced lists tend to be kind of sort of important as well to the player base. Lists and stats that are updated regularly as more data emerges. So the more games that are played, the more events that happen. You sort of see certain models kind of becoming auto-include. You start to see certain armies at the kind of top of the rankings. So the game is constantly updated and kind of adjusted and shuffled around a little bit to try and constantly balance it. And it also means that future releases for certain games that are designed with the game balance in mind. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by competitive player. So a competitive rule set, it can be played casually too. So why wouldn't all games be designed with casual play in mind? And why isn't it just better for everybody if that's the case? So if the company designs a very competitive rule set, which is really finely balanced, which has rules that are constantly kind of updated, they're really clear and concise and really tight, isn't that better for everybody, no matter whether you're a competitive player or whether you're a casual player or a narrative player? I'm not saying that this is my point of view. I'm kind of posing that as a question. That's kind of what I want to explore. So what prompted this was a couple of things I've seen recently online in bits and pieces. But at the weekend, we saw the announcement of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, sort of version 3 or 3.0. And there was an interview with some of the game's designers. And there was a couple of quotes that I've written down here because this is what kind of stood out to me. So one was from Ben Johnson, and he said, "A big thing I wanted to look at was matched play and how you build your armies." And then Jez Bickham was another person who was on the interviews and stuff. And he said, in relation to the new core rules, "Everything we hope is watertight. We've really explained everything that needs to be explained. There should be no room for ambiguity or interpretation." Now, I kind of saw this as a bit of a step on from AOS, because if we remember going back to AOS when it first launched, there was no stats. There was stats. There was no points cost. It was very difficult to have a balanced or a matched player because points didn't exist. And it was something the community took up, sort of wrote their own rules, wrote their own kind of balances to the game, whether it be sort of so many units. Then they started coming up with points. And then eventually Games Workshop decided to kind of include that in the game, and along came the General's Handbook. 40k has always been kind of a competitive game, as in it's always been played at tournaments and people like to get together and play it sort of in a kind of a competition setting. But it's never been that finely balanced. It's never been kind of designed from the ground up with tournament play in mind. And this is where we get things called compacts. It used to happen a lot for Warhammer Fantasy. It used to happen a lot for 40k. And obviously it started with Age of Sigmar as well, which is where the community themselves actually write some limitations or some kind of, you can only take 2 of these because 3's broken type of thing. That's what a compact is, a competition pack. In 9th edition of 40k, they've kind of gone down that tournament kind of competitive route a little bit. They involved people like Frontline Gaming and more playtesters who were very much from that competitive, what's it called? I forget what it's called now, but the 40k kind of tournament circuit, the ITC, that's what I was trying to think of. Those are those kind of compacts of the past. Those people were more involved in 9th edition. And I can see the same thing happening within Age of Sigmar 3.0 as well. So that's kind of what set the brain cells going today anyway. So a few thoughts that I've had, and I'm sure more will kind of pop up for you as we're chatting stuff. So I'd love for you to put them in the comments or to put them in the chat and we can have a little look through them later on. But I'd love to know what your thoughts are too. So in terms of sort of not having just competitive rules, not having to finally balance every single thing you do means you can introduce more kind of swingy mechanics or swingy rules and events and things that happen in the game that might be unbalanced, might be hugely unbalanced, but can kind of generate some hugely enjoyable moments. They can kind of generate those moments that you talk about for weeks and months to come kind of thing. The rules and the stats, they don't need to be updated so often. So it means that it releases the resources generally in some quite small companies. So if you talk kind of like some companies where it's maybe one person's just wrote the rules just on their own, things like Joseph McCulloch for Rangers of Shadow Deep or for Frostgrave and stuff, you tend to find that it releases them to work on expansions or future games as opposed to having to constantly just churn through data and trying to balance the game out and saying, oh, well, this is 1 point too high, or this could do with a bit of an upgrade on its strength attack or something like that. It releases that resource to work on new stuff. And it also means that the players that play those games don't have to keep a constant eye on changes to the rules, on updates, on errata, or on stat changes. Now, it also tends to set the stall out for the kind of community that grows up around these games as well. A more casual game tends, and I say tends, to have a more relaxed community around it as well. They might care more for the background of the game. They might care more about kind of homebrewing their own scenarios or their own little missions and events, and just generally playing by the rule of cool. That just means fielding the models that they like the look of rather than the ones that are the most powerful. Now, this doesn't mean by any stretch that competitive play is bad and that it's full of win-at-all-costs players. That's not the case at all. Within every competitive game system, you still have casual players as well. However, a lot of the online chat and the communities online can be dominated by competitive discussion and the meta. There are plenty of people who play, let's take Warhammer 40k as an example. It's the biggest game out there, and it's very kind of heavily played at tournament level. There are plenty of people out there who just love painting the models. There's plenty of people out there who just love reading the lore and the background, all of the Black Library stuff. But there's a lot of chat online about the balance of lists or how much kind of in points something costs, whether it's undercosted, what's the best battalions, what's the best way to do this kind of thing. There's a lot of kind of list building discussion and competitive discussion online about those particular games. Competitive design games tend to have really tight rules. They have little room for misunderstanding or rules lawyering. For those that don't know what rules lawyering is, it's kind of when somebody tries to interpret a rule in a different way that benefits just them rather than their opponent. And so in theory, the games should run a lot smoother. And we tend to see this in games that have been designed from the ground up with that competitive play in mind. But that said, it only really tends to be an issue when non-competitive rules are played at a competitive level. So, for example, if you take something like 40k, and I'm not bashing on this, it's the most popular, and it's not a game that was initially designed to be very matched, if you like, or to be very balanced or finely balanced. This is when discussion seems to come up, or disagreements, or different interpretations of the rules, is when a game that wasn't designed with that in mind gets played with that. If you're just playing something casually, if you're just playing kind of a bit of a knockabout in the kind of at the game store with a friend or something, those kind of things tend to get kind of decided on the roll of a d6 on a 4+ kind of thing. But when it's something, I say important in inverted commas, when it's a competition or an event or something, especially if you open them top tables, some of those rules discussions can get quite kind of heated at times. And this is really where compacts tend to come from. What you tend to find is that people that run these events and run these tournaments, they see these questions coming round time and time again, and this is where the community tends to kind of say, right, when it comes to a tournament, this is the ruling, this is what we're going to do, kind of thing. Now, competitive rules can sometimes stifle new direction and new ideas in a game, as well as whatever you come up with needs to fit into the game and not break the balance. It needs to not be game breaking. It means that it needs to be good enough that folks want to buy this new model and they want to take it in their armies or in their lists, but they need to be able to want it without it being broken, without it being kind of, what I mean by broken for those that don't know is it basically it breaks the game because it's too overpowered versus its cost compared to like other models. Conversely, it also needs to not be underpowered, because whilst some people will just buy models because they look cool, some people will buy models in a competitive game based upon how good they are. And if the company brings out a new miniature and it might look nice, but it's not as good as something else in the game that would do that job just the same, why would you ever take it? So it doesn't always happen. It doesn't happen and I think, to be fair to 40k, as we talked about before, I think because it is not ultimately finely balanced, it allows them to kind of bring some of this stuff out. It allows them to come back and revisit points down the line and things like that. And some would even say that there is there's a sales model in making something a little bit overpowered, selling a lot of them, and then pulling it back in line with the rest of the game. I'm not suggesting that's what they do. It's a sales model. Competitive games as well can be where we get mismatched games, and this is what when I say mismatched games, I mean mismatched in player expectations. And this is something I think that gives competitive players a bad name, and I think unrightly so. I don't think that there's nothing wrong with people who are competitive. There's nothing wrong with people who prefer to play it in a different way. But if you put the two of them together, who have very different expectations of what they want from a game, this is where it starts to get a little bit kind of a little bit unfun, for want of a better phrase. So one player at a store, for example, if you want to get into a game, you turn up to your local friendly gaming store, you want to play a game, but you like to play competitive. So you've built an army, you've built a list, and you're going there to have a really kind of competitive game. And the only other person who turns up to the store to play that same game is somebody who's just painted a new unit. They just want to have a bit of a run out. They quite like the narrative gaming, they're quite into casual play, and they just want to give their new models a run out. And what can happen is that mismatch in kind of player expectations is where kind of what happens is the competitive player gets a bad name because it's like, oh yeah, I turned up and he just had the hardest list and he just smashed me off the table. There's nothing wrong with the way that person played. It's just the fact that they were looking for a different type of game, that's all. It leads to some bad experiences, really. So thinking about it at first, my first thought was competitive focused rule sets would seem to tick the boxes for everybody. It's a tight rule set. There's no ambiguity. There's no reason not to kind of just to aim your game down that way, and it should tick the box for everybody. But as with most things, the more I thought about it, it's not as simple as that. There's room for many different types of rules, as in there is room for many different types of games. And even Games Workshop have their 3 ways to play in 40k and Age of Sigmar as well. Although personally, I don't really hear of people playing anything other than match player. If you do, I would love to kind of hear that. If you play a kind of like narrative player or open player, I'd love to know that. But personally, in my experience, I don't really hear of those things being played. So what's your thoughts? What do you think I've missed out? Do you only prefer competitive? Do you wish there was only competitive games so that rules ambiguity was a little bit sort of tighter and more watertight, if you like? I'd love to know what you think.
Thanks for watching my video. I hope that you really enjoyed it. And if you did, why not consider clicking on the suggested video below to see more of the work that I've done. If you'd like to support the long-term sustainability of this channel, why not consider checking out my Patreon, where you can pledge and support from as little as $2 a month, and there is lots of different tiers and bonuses which will give you access to a private Discord server. It will give you free t-shirts, free mugs, a podcast every month, and a number of other things, including getting your name at the end of every video, like these awesome folks who already support me now.